Welcome, everybody. I hope that you've all had a valuable several days, and I think that you will find this panel to be particularly interesting and lively. At least that's my goal as the moderator. So welcome to the panel, Reimbursement, Can Value Drive Innovation? My name is Dean Rosen. I'm a partner with a public affairs firm, Melman Vogel Castagnetti, and Breakaway Policy Strategies in Washington, D.C. I've been kind of doing healthcare policy for a couple of decades in Washington, and you can see how well that's worked out. But today I think that we're going to look beyond some of the public policy impacts and dive a little bit deeper, just try to see if we can have a cross-collaborative dialogue about how, against what we see taking place, I think, in the broader healthcare system and the overall fiscal situation of the country are enormous changes. How against those significant changes taking place, value is defined, what the role of patients is in particular in ensuring that valuable treatments not only are approved by the Food and Drug Administration, but ultimately make their way to patients in times when increasingly all payers and all Americans are concerned about rising health costs. And maybe to look at ways that we can open up a dialogue among some of the different groups and organizations and stakeholders in the health system that are represented today. So I think we've got a great panel to do that. For those who've been participating, you know that the Faster Cures style, the Partnering for Cures conferences, to avoid sort of long opening speeches and get right into questions. And so what I'll try to do is keep moving it along, and I think we all hope that we'll have some time to open up for some questions from you all as well. I want to start, I think you've got everybody's biography in the background. I'm not going to do a long introduction, and maybe when we talked a little bit about the order of some of these questions, I think some of these panelists have questions for each other as well. So I think what we'll do is maybe as you open, maybe just in the introduction, talk a little bit about yourself and your perspective beyond the bio that's there. I want to start way at the other end with Steve Ubel. Steve is, is the head of AdvaMed, has been there since 2005. And Steve, I want to open up the panel by asking you, as you look at some of the changes that we just talked about, some of the emerging delivery models like accountable care organizations that Sherry's organization is experimenting with and that came out of the Affordable Care Act, as you look at some of the issues around cost and value, from your perspective, from your members' perspective, what do you see in terms of changes in the landscape and some of the opportunities as well as some of the challenges that some of these changes are bringing for AdvaMed?
Great. Thanks, Dean. Maybe just a little bit more on AdvaMed. We represent the device industry, which is incredibly heterogeneous. I mean, it's everything from the tongue depressor to the artificial heart. It covers all the major sectors in the industry, whether it's cardiovascular, orthopedic, wound care, diagnostics, et cetera. So a very diverse set of players within the sector. To get right into Dean's question, I think you have to step back and have a little bit more context for the overall ecosystem that the device industry operates within. And I don't think it's any secret it's under a fair amount of duress these days. Even in today's Wall Street Journal, as I was reading the paper, venture investment in the medical device industry is down 40% compared to 2007. You're seeing really an exodus of early stage capital from the industry. Over that same period, if you look at 2007, it takes about 75% longer today to get a breakthrough medical technology approved by the FDA than it did 5 years ago. About 45% longer to get an incrementally improved product approved by the FDA. So it's a really challenging environment, particularly for early stage companies where a lot of the innovation occurs. And it's why I think you've seen a lot of focus in the patient community and by other stakeholders on the FDA. And I think it's fair to say that the FDA has driven a lot of that investor concern in recent years. But the payment environment, I think, is equally challenging for companies while there is tremendous opportunity. And maybe we'll just turn to that right now. I think the general sense of our membership is that they support the movement away from fee-for-service to some of these integrated models, whether it's ACOs, bundling, value-based purchasing, and the like. And I do see it as a glass half full in terms of the opportunity for our member companies to reduce costs over a longer time horizon. So obviously, if we have a quality standard, for example, that speaks to colorectal cancer screening, we're going to save a lot more lives at the same time we're diffusing a beneficial medical technology. And you could go on and on. Medtronic, one of our largest member companies, recently acquired a company called CardioCom, which it will pair with its underlying therapy, ICDs, that will deliver a therapy, obviously, to save lives at risk due to fatal arrhythmias, but also capture data associated with congestive heart failure to be able to share that and aggregate that data with payers so that, for example, they can detect fluid buildup that would be a precursor to hospitalization. So increasingly, companies are looking at, double duty, if you will, the technology that will deliver the therapy as well as aggregate data that we think will reduce costs long term. I think the challenge is, as we look at these new payment models, is that the cost efficiency incentives, at least today, are stronger than the quality standards that are in place. And just to give you an example, if you look at hip replacement, the quality standards that speak to hip replacement today are, did you live or die during the procedure, or were you readmitted within 30 days? And that really doesn't speak to whether the patient got the most appropriate technology for their individual needs. Are we giving the 65-year-old athlete the same hip that we're giving the 85-year-old frail elderly? So we've been advocating, and maybe we can get back to this later in the discussion, for some specific safeguards that would not undermine the overall movement to these new payment models, but would ensure that we have a payment-neutral environment for physicians to be early adopters of new technology, that we don't have financial benchmarks and financial incentives in place that put undue pressure on providers to adopt new technology, and that quality standards keep pace with changes in technology as well. If I have a heart attack today and I go to the hospital down the street, I'm supposed to get PCI within 90 minutes. Well, that's great, unless there's a new drug or a new device that comes along. We certainly don't want to have behavior incentivized for providers to adhere to the old standard. So, Dean, I don't know if that helps set the stage for some of the concerns.
That's great. I want to ask you one quick follow-up. You talked about the accountable care organizations and the quality standards, and we'll get to Sherry at some point. As I understand it, there's something like over 4 million people already enrolled in Medicare ACOs, but there's also a lot of interest in private sector emerging delivery models as well. Do you see the same kinds of, I guess, not to put words in your mouth, but sort of cost pressures overwhelming some of the quality standards in both the private and the public ACOs, or is it a Medicare phenomenon exclusively?
I think our experience is that it would apply in both cases. And I should say at the outset, it's interesting if you look at some of the early adopters of that model, so even Mayo or Kaiser or Puget Sound, I mean, you can go across the country, they tend to be early adopters of new technology. So it's not a de facto problem moving into an integrated model. But I think we're starting to see, again, more emphasis and focus on the cost and efficiency measures, and the quality standards, I think, are not there yet.
Great. So Joe Carroll Hyatt is with us from Kaiser Permanente, and obviously that is an integrated model. And so I guess just sort of picking up where Steve left off, talk to us about what you do. Talk to us about the National Product Council, and I think more specifically, when you look at a new drug or a new device, as Steve referenced, what metrics are you looking at? What do you need to know from a payer perspective, and really from one of the most respected integrated models, to make the kinds of decisions on coverage, reimbursement that ultimately patients will receive?
Great, thank you very much. And first, it's a privilege to be here. This has been a really exciting experience for me. I didn't know that this group existed before 2 weeks ago. I do chair our National Product Council, and I oversee all of the contract decisions for everything that Steve is in scope for him. And I also chair the Kaiser Permanente Interregional New Technology Committee, which looks at the evidence, the published literature for devices and procedures. Pretty much everything but pharmacy. We have a separate parallel process for that, and we partner with Cochrane and ECRI and a bunch of other technology evaluation groups. I think that many of you are probably familiar with Kaiser Permanente, but there are some that are not. We have 9.2 of those 400 million ACO population. We've really been an ACO since our inception 70-some years ago, depending on exactly what geography. The majority of our membership is in California, where we have 36 hospitals that we own and operate. We also have hospitals in Portland and Honolulu, Portland, Oregon. I should be careful, I'm on the East Coast. And we also have membership and partner with local hospitals, facilities in Atlanta and around Washington, D.C. and Colorado. So we do have a mixed model. We don't always own our own hospitals. We have 17,000 physicians. They're all salaried. There's no financial pressure for them to adopt or not adopt new technology, to attract referrals or whatever, but they love shiny new objects, and so we do adopt very early many of the technologies that are available. And what we look at, I think, the metaphor I like is a New Yorker cartoon from several years ago, and I need to find something better because some of the people in this room probably are going to have no clue what I'm talking about. It's a scene with two penguins. One of them is holding a camera, and the other one said, "Why on earth did you spring for color film?" And nobody even uses film anymore, but that's really what we're looking for. The outcome you need is a photograph, and black and white is just fine and a lot cheaper. So we actually don't look at cost early. We're really looking for the outcomes. And to Dean's question, our first cut is patient outcomes. And it might be quality of life. It might be return to work. It might be ability to not have to come to the emergency room. It might be an incredibly expensive asthma drug that allows that child to stay in school and stay active, and the parents don't have to take time off work to bring the kid in all the time. So those are the value measures we look at first, but we also will consider things that are really not directly related to the patient outcome. And an example of that might be the Da Vinci robot, which we had teams of urologists doing exactly the same operation, same OR time, a laparoscopic prostatectomy rather than using the robot. They weren't delighted with it. They got tired. That it's a little bit awkward, the ergonomics for them, and so they complained a bit about sore arms. But the patient had the exact same outcome. But we needed to invest in the robots and deploy those because I was having trouble recruiting and keeping urologists. So the reasons we make these decisions may vary, but we really are looking for long-term value. We have registries for almost 200,000 of those hips and knees that Steve referenced, where we are looking for quality of life, exercise tolerance, pain outcomes over many years following the implants. And we use that data when we look at the contracting for the next round of devices. We know in pacemakers how long batteries last. And in our environment, we want the longest battery life we can possibly get. A fee-for-service cardiologist is delighted if the battery dies in regular short intervals. It doesn't work in our system as well. And we use CardioCom.
Well, thank you. Well, in a moment, we're going to ask Sherry Ling a little bit about if, differences in public payers and private, but you mentioned patients, and I think you both did. And we were talking earlier, Bob, some of the earlier panels that you and I were on, there might have been less discussion about patients than we would have wanted. And so I want to get Bob Beelan from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation because for those of you who don't know, CFF has done a ton of work in developing new treatments over the last few years, but I think that the treatment that's really at top of mind for everyone is Kalydeco, and as I understand it, the cost of Kalydeco is about $300,000 a year for a patient. But Bob, I know you're taking a little bit of a different view here in the question of what role there is for patients and what role there is for patient organizations earlier on, not just in advocating, but in looking at the value proposition. And I want you to share some of that with the group.
Well, thank you. I am Bob Bell, and I'm president of the CF Foundation. And we were very early adopters of the venture philanthropy model, starting about 1998, where we started to recognize that if we were going to get new effective therapies to treat the underlying cause of the disease, we had to be more engaged in the de-risking of biotech companies to get engaged. And our de-risking process involved financial. We have a clinical trials network across the country. We have a patient registry. And we put in a number of things that we felt would encourage companies to be engaged with us. And it just was mentioned, we've created a very significant pipeline of drugs that not only treat the basic defect, but treat the symptoms of cystic fibrosis. So we have a vested interest in trying to find out what is the appropriate value with the evaluation of drugs that encourage, innovation and development and discovery versus where the patients can get the drugs in a sustainable fashion over a period of time. And and Kalydeco is obviously one that is first and foremost it came out at $284,000 a year. It was developed as a relationship between ourselves and Vertex pharmaceutical companies, and totally transparent to all of you. We do, as the CF Foundation, get royalty rights off of the drug and its development. So just want to be transparent, but I'm not here to defend the cost of Kalydeco. I don't know whether the $300,000 cost for Kalydeco is that healthy balance between the innovation and access. I don't know that. But what I think is very important is, just as the patient groups have been encouraged to get engaged in the issues of de-risking and all the patient registries and so forth, I think the patient groups have a responsibility to develop data, and can do it beyond just the FDA approval data, to develop data that will create a body of evidence and show the value of effective therapies for the disease that they're interested in. I think patient groups need to be at the table with the industry, with the insurers, the third-party reimbursers, because I think we have access and the ability to obtain data, unlike just a company just trying to get FDA approval. We have access to the patients. We can get patient-reported outcomes. We actually have developed, for Kalydeco, we had those patients with that particular mutation in a clinical trial before the drug was approved. So we had baseline metrics before the drug was even introduced for those patients, and we know the impact of that drug, where we're already seeing reductions of 30% and 40% colonization rates, which is not something the company would have seen at this point. We also know that over the period of 3 years, we're not seeing reductions in the decrease in lung function of those patients, and normally over a period of time, 3 years, we would have lost 4 or 5%. That's the kind of data the patient groups can identify and provide at the table with the insurance companies when they are making those decisions. And what we were talking about earlier is, we as an organization need to know what are the metrics that the insurance companies want to have in terms of what are those value judgments that they make. It can't just be dollars and cents. It's got to be the quality of life. It's got to be the impact on the patients, and it's got to be the kind of data. So we can really start to collect that very early in the process, because we have access to those patients, because 90% of all CF patients are seen in a network of care centers. We have data on those clinical and epidemiological data, demographic data going back to 1965 on all patients seen in the centers. We have a clinical trial network. So again, our hypothesis is, just as you need patient engagement in the de-risking and patient engagement, organization engagement in the patient registries, I think what we have to do is to work collectively as a community and give the patient groups and have them be aware of what is the kind of value judgments that's critical. And one more point. I also think that it's critical that that this is so important to have that information so that the insurance companies and the third-party reimbursers will go ahead and delegate it to the care providers to make the kinds of decisions for chronic diseases so that not having to go back on an annual basis and get prior authorization, not on an annual, monthly basis now, for prior authorizations. You know, insurance companies are using prior authorizations to discourage the use of drugs. We found that our care centers are taking inordinate amount of time filling out prior authorizations on a month-to-month on a chronic disease for drugs that are effective. And again, it's not only the cost, but it's the impact on the healthcare system that's so important. So I think the patients can have value with this.
Okay, Sherry, you're the deputy medical director for one of the largest insurance companies in the country, publicly held, called the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. To Bob's point about metrics, and you heard Joe Carroll talk about the metrics that Kaiser uses, talk to us a little bit about what you're looking at, be it Part A and B in Medicare, but also I think you've heard from some, including Steve in our earlier conversation, some of the criticisms of coverage decisions are getting harder to make, harder to come by. Maybe they're more restrictive than the FDA label. So talk to us about your response to that and whether, and to Bob's point, the kind of metrics that are important for CMS.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So good morning, all. Let me start by focusing on quality, because quality really is a necessary component in the discussion about value. It's actually, I would argue, is the foundation for that calculation of value. That is higher quality for stable or lower cost. And that's the operational definition that CMS really tries to focus on in guiding its policies and principles to achieve the three-part aim, that is higher quality, lower costs, and healthier populations. So, and that cost reduction is really through quality improvement and focusing on quality. So that is delivering better care is also cost savings. So I think that's one of the general principles that we try to impart, and it's a guiding principle for the National Quality Strategy, which is the strategy that all CMS programs and policies are really aligning according to. And important to know that cost and efficiency is just one of the domains. Importantly, one of the other domains, and really what our true north is that of patient-centeredness, family-centeredness. There is no care that's delivered without me as a partner in it. So what that looks like is also a guiding principle for what outcomes we would focus on. It is true that currently the quality measurement, much of which is process-based. That is, we look at processes of care optimally that are linked to improving outcomes, but what those outcomes should be and what is meaningful, we can only know by involving patients in that conversations. So to your point earlier, Stephen, as far as for joint replacement, it is true that there are quality metrics that are a step towards being able to assess outcome. But what is actually meaningful, we only know by asking patients. And what would be the data source that one could rely on to assess that we as a system could employ to drive the value conversation towards? Now, what outcomes are meaningful? My experience has been through multiple speaking engagements and really getting to know advocacy organizations and the patients that they represent. They really all, despite the fact that they may have different labels, cystic fibrosis or cancer of whatever type, they really want the same thing. They have some domains that are important across the board. They want to feel better. They would like to have their suffering alleviated. Ideally, they would like to be able to achieve those normal daily activities that we take for granted, to walk, to take care of their families, and so on and so forth. So really, what are those commonalities that we could speak towards in an outcome-based measurement system? And that's something that is work in progress. I will also say that being that coverage is an issue, coverage decisions, particularly for parts A and B for devices as the ones that have been mentioned earlier, really those decisions are predicated on the evidence. The evidence that a device or treatment is reasonable and necessary to improve outcomes that are meaningful. And again, how do we know this if we neglect to involve patients in that conversation? So I think multiple points, and the convergence points are really upon the patient. Quality measurement is moving in the direction in focusing on outcomes with really a true north of what patients believe to be meaningful. I think two examples that I can mention is, and we've implemented patient and family experience of care, the CAP survey, as a starting point. It's a data collection mechanism it's a survey that was employed because of feasibility, but it is a first step. It's not the end game. But how providers score or fare on their patient and family experience of care means something. Hospitals actually, that domain is weighted fairly heavily in hospital value-based purchasing. Experience of care will be reported on Physician Compare. It's a matter of when can we put in place the data collection mechanisms to allow that. And I will also say for any of the metrics that are developed and proposed, developed out there by any of you who do research and suggested to the National Quality Forum and then recommended for implementation in any of the quality reporting programs, that will be the foundation for the physician value modifier, for hospital value-based purchasing, for end-stage renal disease facilities, value-based purchasing. All of that will also ride on what matters to patients. So I think that we have really more convergence than we have disparities or discordance. It's a matter of building the data sets and the evidence that can inform the decisions that are made.
Let me just ask a quick follow-up, because you heard Bob talk about CF and their experience, and you mentioned patients. Do you see the kind of involvement by patient groups in terms of developing registries, developing evidence? And I know we're talking about a drug, and you were talking about some device examples, but do you see that regardless of the treatment, or is what CF is doing unique and something that should be replicated and would be helpful from a CMS standpoint?
I think there's improvement opportunities across the board. It is one that I would like to see more of. What you do is really a model, but can be replicated across multiple dimensions. But really, again, working together with other advocacy organizations, what is the final comment? What is common to your patient population needs, rather than splitting between disease states? Because really, when it comes to the Medicare population, you mentioned that the devices are heterogeneous. The population of Medicare beneficiaries and those beneficiaries that are provided services for through Medicare, Medicaid, in whatever system, is becoming increasingly heterogeneous. And likely, they do not have just one disease. So I think for many, many reasons, really looking for the commonalities is the most efficient way to proceed.
Great. I want to get Alan, and I saw Joe Carroll wanted to make one quick
Yeah, it's a quick comment, and it goes to what you just asked, Dean, and that is that when we look at the evidence, when we're trying to make a decision about a product, a device, most of the literature has what they label as patient-reported outcomes, but I think we have to be careful to understand those are researcher, scientist defined for the patient outcomes, and they may or may not reflect what the patients truly are interested in. And we often find that those outcomes are not consistent across the body of literature in that category of device or research. So giving a lot more upstream thought to defining those consistently with patient engagement and advocacy group engagement, I think would really help us make a much more rational decision.
Alan, I was struck by one thing Sherry said in terms of alignment and improving care or better care can also lead to cost savings. You're trying to shift the paradigm a little bit that we've been talking about in your approach. Talk to us a little bit about what you're doing and why it's important.
Thank you, Dean. So the first thing is I should admit to two genetic deficits. I was born underexpressing the genes for patience and overexpressing the genes for disruptiveness. I spent my adult life, most of it, 20 years, leading a regenerative medicine institute in Pittsburgh. And if ever there was a place where you would fine-tune impatience and disruptiveness, it's when you are in a field that is incredibly exciting, but at the same time you find over 20 years that you answer the question, when will this make a difference? The same way for 20 years. And the answer is always 3 to 5 years. You know, we're almost there. We've almost been there forever. And that's just incredibly frustrating. So over a long period of time, I began to think about why is it that we're always almost there, but never quite making it? And began to seek for how we could align interests in such a way that we could really accelerate the development of therapies for patients. And I think what we're all at this meeting to talk about is going faster. It's in the name. We want to go faster. It's all about acceleration. So if you think about an MRI machine, what it does, it takes a big giant magnet, it takes all those misaligned protons, you switch the magnet on, the protons align, and all of a sudden everything's very clear. You can see everything that you need to see. What we became interested in our community was, what are the missing pieces? And there were two elements that I became fascinated by. One of those was the degree to which the system, the academic medical centers, the academic healthcare centers, were a big part of the solution, but also a big part of the challenge and the problem. It is a huge system, and it doesn't like to change. And the reality is that if we're healthy, the hospital doesn't make money. And what I saw in the regenerative medicine space is that as truly curative therapies got closer and closer to changing clinical practice, so some of the barriers from within the system would go up to sort of slow things down because it might complicate the issues. So that sort of emerged, and then at the same time there was the reality that the payer community wasn't really engaged in what we were doing. The typical way of developing a therapy is you think about it, you test it, you publish it, you go into a development cycle, you get it regulated, and then you go and talk to a payer about, are you willing to pay for it? And it seemed to me that that was an incredible misalignment of interests, because in fact, if we're healthy, the payer actually benefits financially from that. So why isn't the payer actually driving innovation? And you do see now at CMS, you see a tremendous driving of innovation, much of it about how medicine is practiced, not so much about what the tools are that we might use to practice medicine with. So not necessarily CMS saying, develop this new drug or develop this new device. But we became interested in Pittsburgh in, well, why not? Why wouldn't a payer actually say, you know what, this is a device that we would buy. Here is a missing piece of the puzzle. If you innovate in this space, we actually want this. Mm-hmm. And we want it so much, we will pay for it and we'll hold you accountable for the speed at which you develop it. And we will aggressively help you to develop it. So, you know, you sort of shake your head for a few years when you start thinking about this, and you sort of think, yeah, there's no way that the payer community would find that appealing. But actually, we decided, and the we is Carnegie Mellon University, which has no medical school, so no medical school politics, and none of those sort of impediments. If an innovation comes out of a university with no medical school, if it can find a runway, it'll go really fast down that runway. Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield is the third largest of the Blue Crosses in the country, about 6 million members. Carnegie Mellon and Highmark got together. We had a discussion, and surprisingly, within about 10, 20 minutes, the CEO of Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield said, you know what, you're right. We really should be doing this. I don't know why we're not. We should be investing not just in innovative policies and practices with existing tools, but we should be using our data to tell you where to develop tools and to tell you where clinical practice is weak, cost is high, and where a technology-based solution is absent. But if you can do it, then it'd be great. So maybe I'll close with saying that for people like me who like to have lots of ideas and do a lot of things, that we can solve almost any problem that we come across. The problem is that we don't know what problem to solve. So it's a little bit like Dr. Ling was saying this morning. If you target innovation, there are lots of innovative people who will solve the problems. The challenge in our community is that a huge segment of healthcare, the payer segment, has really not participated in that earliest stage of the discussion about saying, you know what, here's a real issue. And what's so important to us, we'll put money on the table to fund it. So we created this Disruptive Health Technology Institute. Now my disruptive genes can be very happily expressed because I have disruption on my business card. And my impatience can be addressed because we're trying to do things quickly, not slowly. So
I own two quick follow-up questions. One is, in the early going, have you found areas where there really hasn't been complete alignment, or where there have been challenges to try to bring the views together?
So maybe the story I'll tell is it's actually a regenerative medicine story, and it's brief. Esophageal cancer, I think everybody is aware of the outcomes of people who get a diagnosis of esophageal cancer. If you ask the question, what's the therapy for that? It's to take out the esophagus, you bring the stomach up to the throat, and it's a very tough quality of life for the few years that a patient has. It's a very expensive therapy. It has about a 50% complication rate and a pretty high morbidity rate, mortality rate. So we can do better. It turns out there are some regenerative medicine approaches that could intervene at the early stages in terms of treating esophageal cancer when it's just a precancerous lesion. What I saw over a period of years was, and by the way, a large hospital system would typically make tens of millions of dollars a year providing the removal of the esophagus. What I saw is that as that regenerative medicine clinical trial went forward and seemed to demonstrate some success, now the barriers to the flow of patients into those trials begun to be restricted. Maybe it was just caution. Maybe it was the fact that a very important business line was potentially going to be changed. But yes, the system, someone once told me, the institution doesn't love us back. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. So just because you invent something, if you haven't taken care of where the barriers are likely to be in the future by aligning the right people to make sure that those barriers are removed, the barriers will stop progress, will get in the way.
Mm-hmm. And my other quick question, Alan, is you're working on this disruptive enterprise in one region of the country. Do you see the potential for that to be replicated elsewhere? And what would it take to do that?
Yeah, I think the model is entirely scalable. There's nothing really very clever about what we're doing. We're simply saying that we should engage with all the members of the community that care about this, patients, providers, and payers, and innovators, and bring them together, and that we should use data to target where innovators, where scientists and engineers target their work. For the most part, scientists and engineers, we like to convince the DARPAs of the world to give us money. They think they're going to get what we want, and then we like to do what we want. And DARPA is well aware of that trend. If we could use data to drive where we do innovation, we would take, I believe, a decade out of the 2 decades it takes to create change. So doing that is entirely scalable.
And then, Steve, I want to ask you one question that Alan's comments raised with me, and then we'll turn it back to you guys, which is, from Alan's comments, you talked about some of the disjointedness in the research enterprise, where you do the research early on and then you worry about coverage down the road. But you also talked about some of the challenges that you have seen around reimbursement, be it public or private payers. Do your members feel this tension between creating the evidence base to show what it takes to get through FDA approval, and then at the same time or down the road, the evidence base that it takes to get something covered or reimbursed?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's great potential around things like parallel review. We talked a little bit before coming on stage about this, where you would engage CMS at the same time you're engaging FDA in trial design questions and registry questions. And I think there is potential on that front, because you still have a situation at CMS where these determinations are largely sequential. You have to get a coverage decision, you have to have a code assigned, and then you have to find your way into one of Medicare's myriad payment systems. And that can still take an inordinate period of time. However, the early experience on parallel review has not produced substantial time savings, and I think we need to continue to work on how we can streamline. And as we were discussing again previously, Kaiser and others have these incredible registry databases, and Bob spoke to this as well. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we could access some of that information that already exists, rather than having to develop a registry from scratch, if you will? So I do think that companies continue to, you'd have to be living under a rock to be a device company that's not thinking about, how do I differentiate my technology? How do I produce the evidence of value? Increasingly, companies have to open their aperture beyond what happens within a DRG. It's really what happens across a year of time that an ACO, for example, is bearing risk for that patient. But at the same time, they still have challenges meeting these evolving standards of what it takes to get there.
Sherry, do you want to respond to that?
Certainly. Parallel review is one of the vehicles that CMS has really been part of to foster innovation and efficiency, but I would say that there's still improvement opportunities there, that if we know where there are stops and obstacles and what impedes the path of progress, then if there are models that have the efficiency in delivering the evidence that's required for coverage decisions, I think that model also can be scaled and spread. I think we're really eager to engage early in the conversations, and perhaps it has not translated into something that is palpable yet, but we are getting more and more inquiries early on, as opposed to at the end game after all is said and done, for CMS to then say, I'm sorry, the evidence you provided is just this much insufficient, is really disappointing and is unfortunate. So, we're really, CMS is eager to engage in that conversations, and again, would like to know about other systems where that efficiency has been gained to create the evidence that is needed to drive towards the outcomes that we desire.
Alan, you want to get in here, and then Bob?
Yeah, I was just going to mention an interesting model that's emerging right now in Japan. It's specifically in the regenerative medicine and cell therapy space, but they're creating a new mode of approval. The Japanese FDA is creating a provisionally approved category, which they're willing to give to products that have gone through a phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trial, but not yet a phase 3 clinical trial. They will give the provisional approval on the basis of good phase 2 data. That will then allow their reimbursement agencies to reimburse those products at an agreed upon cost. And then there's a period of time over which the studies then of reimbursed patients getting this are going through phase 3. So they're actually, it's a kind of unique model that they put in place specifically because of the struggles of cell-based therapies to get to the market quickly. But it's one that could be adopted in any area and that has really few risks.
Bob, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment because I wish all of our CF patients eventually got to be Medicare patients. That hasn't quite happened yet, in terms of older patients. There's an insurance program out there called Medicaid that 60% of our patients are impacted upon, and I'm sure any company thinks about that. And that, to me, is a big black box with a big question mark as to what drives their decisions. Is it a capricious medical director who makes his decision? Is it a panel? That's a big group out there that we need to know what drives their decision-making process. Is it dollars in the bank? Because if that's the case, we got a problem. But what's going to happen in the system, and you're really engaged in the federal system, that is going to allow us to be able to try to anticipate the decision-making process, because that would be a real barrier for innovation for those diseases where you have a large Medicaid population. 60% of our patients are on some sort of a Medicaid program. And, so far we're doing okay. Few states we're not doing okay. But where do we start? What do we do here?
May I?
Go ahead,
Okay.
absolutely, yeah.
So I think we start by focusing on quality. For the reason that we have alignment and we're marching towards alignment of the quality metrics for Medicare and Medicaid, again, along the domains that are specified by the National Quality Strategy. I think that is really one of the important convergence points. Many of the decisions, as you know, there's separation of policies for national coverage decisions. There's still local authority, and most of which, even for Medicare, but also Medicaid, these are within the state authorities. Now, having said that, I think there's consistencies in the policies, and I think there is effort to make those policies and procedures more transparent. Criteria that are used to make those decisions. Cost is not the only driver, though. I think importantly, quality has to be part of the equation. And in an area that, speaking to some of the comments earlier, really what we're trying to get at is using the data to know when there's a gap in care. Right? So one approach is to look at those most common conditions and also that are most costly, just as a starting point to engage in the conversations. And again, in a very data-driven approach, the data translates then into future evidence.
Great. Well, we've got a few minutes left, and I want to give folks in the audience a little bit of time to ask questions that they may have been sitting and thinking about during the discussion. So if someone wants to raise their hand, this gentleman right here.
I know Joe Selby was here speaking yesterday, but there hasn't been any talk about PCORI, which is the organization that's supposed to be developing this evidence base. So can anyone address why you're not thinking about PCORI as an avenue to developing that?
Joe, do you want to talk about the PCORI's role? Because I think they're getting going, they're looking at a subset, and you're probably looking at a broader set. But do you want to talk a little bit about PCORI from your standpoint?
Yeah, so Joe actually left Kaiser Permanente to lead PCORI. So we know Joe. He's an extremely talented researcher. And I know that with both PCORI and AHRQ, there are a number of initiatives in process. But I think the real question is, that 3 to 5 year comment is probably applicable. When are we going to have something that really is information we can use and make decisions around? And I think as bureaucratic and large and complicated as Kaiser Permanente is, we may get there earlier. With what we can do internally. We are very interested in innovation, and we have a lot of research. We do phase 3, generally not earlier trials, but we do participate in a lot of phase 3 trials, and we're very interested in particularly taking on the devices or other research that it needs that more real world rather than the academic medical center component, because we do have this longevity of membership, and we can Mine are electronic medical record, sort of. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. It's not just a simple keystroke, but it's there. And so I think we have the potential to help with this. But for PCORI specifically, I personally have not seen something come from there that I can just drop into our system and say, look, this is how we should change.
So one perspective is not actionable yet. Sherry, do you want to say something here too?
Sure. So, acknowledging that really time is of the essence, and the quality and evidence continuum, generation of evidence, can be long, and it really is too slow. As we look for system efficiencies, I think there's another area of evidence that we often overlook, and that is one of quality improvement. And where there are signals of low quality is one to pay attention to in the care delivery process. Where there is perhaps overuse, your system should know. There is incredible variability across the country on the costs and the expenditures, geographic variability within a certain geographic location. There's also quality disparities. And so those are opportunities still to improve in the here and now based on quality improvement principles and practices. Again, scale and spread from lessons learned and sharing what works and avoiding what doesn't work as we gather the evidence that we need to make policy decisions.
Great. Bob?
And with the PCORI, we think many of the things that they've asked to be done or looking at, I think are very innovative. But I think we actually went through, the CF Foundation went through a letter of intent. And then we looked at the bureaucracy that was associated with it. And we became as concerned about, we're a pretty impatient group. And so we've decided to bring many of the things in-house to be able to do it in a quicker, and we were talking to Cincinnati Children's Hospital, have got some very innovative programs in terms of patient engagement and developing, and they're doing it for other diseases, and we're talking in terms of CF, but it's really looking at getting the patient engagement into processes that are up and running in some institutions already. And so we're excited, and we're thinking about bringing those in, and we've already developed a quality improvement program for our centers. We went with Dartmouth almost 10 years ago and developed that. And we have a care experience survey in our care centers, and we have very evidence-based guidelines. So we have brought a lot of the principles in there because of all of our feeling about the sense of urgency to get some of these things going, because we do believe that the important part of the metrics that will ultimately show the value has to come from the patients, and much of our research has to be driven from what the patients want. So I think PCORI is a great idea. I think we can all, pick and choose some certain elements of it. Some organizations might go with it, but I think for ourselves, we just decided it's easier and quicker to go it alone.
Let's see if anyone's got one more question. Let's do it right here in the middle.
Is comparative effectiveness driving these conversations of value? And if so, when will we begin to see this playing out a little more significantly?
So comparative effectiveness, a question kind of related to PCORI. Do you wants to jump in here?
Well, I'll make a quick comment in that Kaiser Permanente has made an investment in this. We hired Beth McGlynn from RAND, who's very experienced in this area, and we have a Center for Effectiveness and Safety Research that we call CSER that Beth heads. They are making some progress. I am relatively familiar with some of the things they're working on, but they're taking some of the big picture things. They're not doing comparative effectiveness at the level I need for the work I do, so I'm not super familiar with exactly what they're doing. It's more epidemiology.
All right. I think we've got 30 seconds left, and I think what I'm going to do is allow Bob from the patient perspective, because part of the goal was to try to get at the patient perspective. I'm going to ask you, Bob, to have the last word. You can answer what I ask, or you can answer whatever you want. Which is my thought is anything you heard today in the discussion give you more hope? Do you leave this discussion more optimistic, having some of the key stakeholders here for the last nearly hour together, or opportunities to have the system work better for patients and get life-saving and life-extending treatments to them.
Absolutely. I think this is a very encouraging conversation. Sherry and I were on a forum earlier this year, and we asked what the metrics were that we needed to start to collect, and there was a person in the audience who represented an insurance company who says, we really work for the employer, not for the patient. And that was a kind of a shattering. And it's really good to see what Kaiser's doing in terms of trying to get these metrics. It's encouraging. It's also encouraging to hear what CMS is doing in terms of efficacy, efficiency of the new therapies. And we have to look at efficacy and efficiency of the systems that deliver these therapies. We have a care center network, accredited care center network. Those cannot be going to the lowest bidder for those things. So I think all of these things are encouraging. I just hope they become universal in the thought process, because this is a very exciting time for rare diseases. And as soon as insurance companies do not see, it was always just wants to see a pathway through regulatory affairs. It's got to be a pathway through reimbursement before they're going to make the kinds of investments in innovation. And I think some of the words we heard here today should give some solace to the technology and the industry that there are pathways, especially if you involve the patient groups in the process, that will allow these kind of innovations to take place.
Great. Well, listen, I want to thank everyone on the panel. I think this was very thought-provoking. I want to thank Faster Cures for allowing me to participate, moderate, and learn along with you today. And just please join me in a big round of applause for everyone here today.